because we could not be trusted. The Emperor needed a weapon that would never obey its own desires before those of the Imperium. He needed a weapon that would never bite the hand that feeds. The World Eaters were not that weapon. We've all drawn blades purely for the sake of shedding blood. And we've all felt the exaltation of winning a war that never even needed to happen. We are not the tame, reliable pets the Emperor wanted. The wolves obey when we would not. The wolves can be trusted when we never could. They have a discipline we lack, because their passions are not aflame with the butcher's nails buzzing in the back of their skulls. The wolves will always come to heel when called. In that regard, it is a mystery why they call themselves wolves. They are tamed, collared by the Emperor, obeying his every whim. But a wolf does not behave that way. Only a dog does. That is why we are the World Eaters, and why the Warhounds no longer.
Excerpt from Captain Khorne of the World Eaters, 8th Assault Company, from his unpublished treatise on the XVIII Legions. The World Eaters are one of the most infamous Traitor Legions of Chaos Space Marines, who now dwell within the twisted warp rift known as the Eye of Terror, located in the Segmentum Obscurus section of the Imperium of Man. Their journey from one of the Emperor's chosen warriors to the blood-soaked disciples of Khorne is a chilling tale of betrayal, violence, and madness, and a story that is a grim reminder of the devastating, corrupting power of chaos. The Legion was originally designated as the 12th Legion of the first founding of Space Marines, and they bore the name War Hounds, renowned for their ruthless efficiency and tenacity in battle. They were forged to be the Imperium's most brutal of shock troops. Even in the earliest of days, the Legion was displaying its ferocity in battle, which bordered on monstrous, long before Chaos ever deemed it worthy to touch their ranks. Yet it was not only their feral nature that set them apart, but also the shadow of their fate, the moment that they would abandon the Emperor of Mankind to serve Horus, and eventually the god of blood and war, Khorne. The World Eaters' transformation can be traced back to their Primarch, Angron, whose tragic and bloody upbringing forever shaped the destiny of his legion. Discovered on the world of Nuceria, Angron was enslaved as a gladiator and had his rage amplified by the torturous cybernetic implants known as the Butcher's Nails. These implants rewired his mind, forcing him into a state of constant uncontrollable fury, a curse that would later define his entire legion, and their doctrine of unrelenting violence. Angron's nigh indomitable will drove him to lead a rebellion against his masters, rallying his fellow slave gladiators in a desperate bid for freedom. Yet their triumph would be short-lived, as they were pursued by the might of Nuceria's highly advanced armies. Angron and his warriors would eventually find themselves cornered in the mountains, facing truly overwhelming odds, as they prepared to sell their lives dearly, costing their enemies as much as humanly possible, almost quite literally digging their own graves and making a solemn promise to fight together to the bitter end. It was in this pivotal moment that the Emperor arrived, having observed his son's struggles from orbit, and offered Angron a place amongst the stars as one of his generals, seeing as the Emperor sought to recruit the Primarch to the Great Crusade. Angron, however, refused, unwilling to abandon his battlekin to their ultimate fate. As the Nucerian forces closed in, the Emperor, unwilling to lose a son of such potential, teleported Angron aboard his vessel, leaving the Primarch's loyal followers to be slaughtered to the last. This act was seen as pragmatic and necessary by the Emperor, would eventually inspire Angron to commit an unforgivable betrayal, as it in of itself was what he viewed as an unforgivable betrayal, a betrayal that would poison his relationship with the greater Imperium forevermore. Though Angron was forced to serve the Emperor, his fury would only deepen, and the seeds of his eventual fall were sown. The Butcher's Nails, a relic of the past, would eventually be replicated and installed across his legion as a whole, eroding what little was left of their humanity and binding them to their Primarch's brutal philosophy. When the time came, Angron was ready to join Horus in rebellion, plunging the 12th into the abyss of chaos. As the Horus heresy would unfold, the World Eaters pledged themselves to the blood god Khorne, whose domain included war and murder, leading the already savage legion to be further corrupted, leaving their only purpose to be the spilling of blood in Khorne's name. Unity amongst the World Eaters would eventually dissolve in the face of their unquenchable bloodlust, and the Legion would then splinter into countless innumerable warbands, each roaming the stars as a storm of death and terror made manifest. The World Eaters' reputation as unparalleled assault troops was at least in part born from Angron's own ethos and their brutal campaigns for annihilation. Every battle they fought etched the infamy of the World Eaters deeper into the records of galactic history. To this day, their warbands scour the stars, leaving behind trails of bloody slaughter that serve as dark offerings to their unholy patron. From the broken chains of Nuceria to the unrelenting carnage of the 41st millennium, the World Eaters' story is one of wrath unleashed and humanity forsaken. A reminder of what transpires when loyalty is replaced by bloodlust and brotherhood gives way to betrayal. The saga of the World Eaters is truly a sad one that continues to this day. The greatest change in the War Hounds would come upon Angron's assuming of command, and eventually, in order to better relate to their father, the Butcher's nails were replicated. These cybernetic implants, which had once enslaved him, also did factually amplify his physical strength, aggression, and combat prowess. And eventually, the Mechanicum, along with some of the World Eaters' tech adapts, would reverse engineer the technology and improve it, removing the aspect of it that eventually kills its wearer. And while the implants were overall crude imitations of Angron's own, they did in fact succeed in magnifying the raw fury and power each individual legionary was able to bear down on their opponent. As a result, they would be implanted across the entirety of the Legion, and the results of this were undeniable. Enhanced by their implants, the World Eaters became the Imperium's deadliest premier shock troops, capable of tearing through enemy lines with a ferocity that could only be matched by the Blood Angels in their darkest days. Yet the price for such ferocity became clear. The implants not only heightened aggression, they also eroded each legionary's self-control. On the blood-soaked fields of Gehenna, this curse would reach its zenith as the World Eaters butchered the planet's entire population in a single night, unable or unwilling to temper their unleashed wrath. The massacre in Gehenna seems to have been a bridge too far, as the Emperor could not ignore it. So Angron faced his father's rebuke, and he was ordered to cease the implantation of the Butcher's nails into his warriors. However, at this point, Angron decided to defy his command. His obsession with ensuring his legion's dominance at the time would override any sense of restraint or obedience. This defiance would later be one of the seeds of distrust planted, which would inevitably widen the chasm between the Emperor and his blood-soaked son. When the Post-heresy would eventually erupt, the World Eaters were at its vanguard, their savagery unleashed upon the battlefields of the Imperium. Eventually, during the climactic siege of Terra, they would take the lead in the assault of the Imperial Palace. With no regard for their own lives, the World Eaters stormed the breach. Their unending, unstoppable violence was unmatched amongst the traitor forces. By this time, the Butcher's nails had fully corrupted their minds, and only a scant few could contain the rage and think clearly for any sort of time. Any vestiges of discipline or honor had essentially been consumed by bloodlust. At the height of the siege, Angron himself would devolve into a berserk, blood-soaked monster, a shadow of himself, the once proud gladiator who sought freedom on Nuceria gone, as he had been elevated to the rank of Demon Prince by Khorne, the god of war's very own demon Primarch. Angron would embody his will, and his presence on the battlefield would become a whirlwind of nigh unstoppable death and destruction. It was said that the World Eaters were the last of the traitor forces to ever abandon Terra, their berserk fury defying even the retreat orders by Horus's forces as the War Master prepared for his final confrontation with the Emperor. The defeat on Terra marked the beginning for the Legion's final unraveling. Retreating to the Eye of Terror, the World Eaters would eventually turn their unrestrained violence inwards. The Butcher's nails had stopped them from having any form of cohesion or reason as a legion, leading to a bitter internecine war shattering the Legion itself and splintering the once great 12th into countless war bands. This bloody fracturing, however, seemed to amuse their patron, Khorne. Angron's ascension to demonhood was also a clear sign of the Blood God's favor, even as the Legion itself ceased to to exist as a unified force. On rare occasions, Angron would gather the scattered warbands under his banner, but these were fleeting moments of unity, driven by the promise of a greater slaughter. From the Battle of Scalathrax, where the Legion's fracturing was cemented, to the present day, the World Eaters have remained a terror upon the galaxy. Their warriors, including the infamous Khorne berserkers, are amongst the deadliest close combat fighters the galaxy has ever known. They are like a storm of blood and destruction as they roam the galaxy in disparate warbands of Chaos Space Marines, fighting for the sole purpose of spilling blood and taking skulls in the name of Khorne. Today, their story stands more as a warning than anything else of the insurmountable price of unbridled fury and the corruption of power unimaginable. Once heralded as a Warhounds, the Emperor's savage yet loyal shock troops, the 12th Legion now serves only as a symbol of betrayal and bloodlust, forever bound to the blood god's dark will. Whether on the battlefields of the Imperium or in the twisted depths of the warp, the World Eaters now embody the terrifying extremes of violence and the ruin it leaves in its wake. In its inception, the Legion adhered to the Terran pattern of organization, a standardized framework developed by the Imperial Officio Militaris at the dawn of the Great Crusade, and even then, the Legion exhibited a preference for direct assault tactics, specializing in brutal close quarters combat within deadly environments normally classified as zone mortalis, battlegrounds where the enemy had nowhere to run, were their preference. This panache for aggressive tactics only intensified under Angron's leadership. While the basic organizational structure of the Legion was preserved, it was streamlined significantly to align with the Primarch's military philosophy. The emphasis was on mass infantry formations, hybrids of tactical and close-quarter assault units, supported by heavy assault contingents, including Terminator-clad veterans and fast-moving units such as land speeder squadrons. This structure complemented Angron's preference for a swift and overwhelming offensive, where strategic objectives were secondary to raw destruction and slaughter. While undeniably effective, this approach came at a steep cost, in particular in casualties being disproportionately high within the legions. There is also Angron's disdain for pomp and hierarchy, being reflected in the legion's rank structure. Titles were rather sparse, and authority was earned through battlefield prowess and leadership rather than ceremonial honors. It was said that Angron forbade his warriors from addressing him as Lord, preferring a simple functional chain of command. Yet beneath the simplicity lay a volatile culture of violence. Discipline within the legions was harsh and often brutal, as authority was backed up by force, and officers were expected to enforce their orders through personal combat if necessary. Disobedience on the battlefield was punished by summary execution, often at the hands of the very commanding officer in charge of said individual. Conflict within ranks was resolved through trials by combat, a practice Angron not only condoned but greatly encouraged. These trials could escalate to challenges for leadership, exclusively fought to the death. This system forged a legion where strength and survival were paramount, but it also fostered an environment where tempers flared and violence simmered constantly beneath the surface. Another particular point in their history was Angron's arrival and the implementation therein of the butcher's nails, as the implants would forever become the defining characteristic of the World Eaters. These crude imitations of Angron's own cybernetics did have one advantage. They would not kill their wearer over time, like Angron's were, and once the enhancements were installed, they were installed into every single neophyte, amplifying their aggression and obliterating almost any form of self-control they had. These implants transformed structured legionaries into unparalleled melee combatants, but this came at a terrible cost, as many succumb to uncontrollable bloodlust, rendering them a liability to even their allies. However, this was not a rule, as there are still many World Eaters who are able to resist the call of the nails, to the point that some of them even start gardens and farms for entertainment. As the Post-heresy would unfold, this psychosurgical dependency deepened further still. New recruits were hastily inducted and subjected to implants without hesitation. The result of this was a legion driven by carnage for its own sake, not allowing them to adapt to their transformed bodies before receiving the implant. By the time the betrayal at Isstvan III would occur, the World Eaters were barely recognizable as the disciplined warriors they had once been, and Isstvan III would mark a significant turning point for the Legion. At this event, Angron's forces participated in the culling of loyalist elements from their own ranks. In particular, mostly those who had originally been warhounds and fought on Terra alongside the Emperor's original legions. Of the estimate 150,000 World Eaters active at the time, well over 35,000 of them were killed during this campaign. The staggering loss included casualties on both sides of the conflict, as loyalists fought tooth and nail against their traitorous brethren in a bitter yet bloody, undeniable purge. Amongst the survivors of the conflict, many would fall to madness in the heat of battle, their minds entirely consumed by the feedback of the butcher's nails. These berserk warriors had to be forcibly restrained and removed from the battlefield, then placed in containment. Despite these losses, the World Eaters remained a rather formidable force, bolstered by a fleet of at least 60 capital-class vessels, surrounded and supported by the Legio Audax Titan Legion, also known as the Ember Wolves. By this stage, the World Eaters had become a double-edged sword, even for the traitors and their allies. The insatiable bloodlust and preference for all-out infantry assaults, supported by fast-moving armor, made them devastatingly effective yet unstable companions. Their battles often would devolve into carnage for its own sake, commonly ignoring strategic goals entirely. The World Eaters' transformation from the disciplined, albeit hot-blooded warriors of the War Hounds into the fractured legions of berserkers they are now mostly known as exemplifies the perils of their unchecked aggression. Now, the World Eaters' recruitment and training regiment is rather distinct, as under their Primarch, Angron, who was widely regarded as one of, if not the most brutal in the history of the Adeptus Astartes, attrition rates were catastrophic, both during the induction of new recruits and within the battlefield ranks of the Legion itself. By all accounts, no other Space Marine Legion endured or inflicted such levels of fatality upon its aspirants during recruitment, and this relentless methodology did serve as a crucible for forging warriors of unparalleled and unending savagery, though it often came at the cost of the aspirants' humanity. From the outset, gladiatorial contests and live fire exercise drills formed the core of the Legion's training regiment. These were no mere simulations, as they were functionally battles to the death, where failure meant annihilation. Blades were sharpened and rounds were live, meaning the stakes could not be any higher. Such methods ensured that only the strongest and most aggressive, along with the most resilient recruits, survived to claim the honor of fully becoming part of the Legion's ranks. Angron believed that only through such merciless trials could warriors be honed to the levels demanded by the 12th Legion's ethos. To meet the unceasing demands of war, Angron streamlined the recruitment process, as recruitments were drawn from the harshest feral feudal worlds that they could get across the segmenta of the Imperium, worlds where survival itself required a natural aptitude for violence. These harsh environments served as natural breeding grounds for the type of warriors Angron sought, individuals for whom death was not feared but embraced as a part of everyday life. Training for them was not limited to individual combat, as entire companies and battalions clashed in massive war games, competing in violent matches that emphasized unit cohesion and battlefield tactics, despite on a macro scale not appearing to be so. Angron personally would observe these engagements, judging not only the martial prowess of the individuals involved, but the effectiveness of their coordination and collective cohesiveness. Despite these efforts, the Legion's ultimate force remained unplacable. The brutal reality of war allowed their champions to be forged and their officers to earn stations through blood and fire. Now, back to the early days of the Legion. The origins of the 12th Legion on Terra are often shrouded in no small amount of mystery, in large part due to mostly partial records being the primary sources. Unlike many of the other legions, the 12th Legion tied to a specific geographical recruiting ground. Instead, fragmentary evidence suggests that an experimental screening process was employed for the Legion during its formation, all the way back during the Emperor's own design. This process reportedly selected candidates with highly aggressive and competitive traits, resulting in a force that even in its infancy was noted for both savagery and a ferocious temperament. The fledgling Legion's first recorded deployment was during the Segelfrick Liberation, in the final stages of the Unification Wars, a conflict that would showcase their aggressive tenacity. However, following these early victories, the 12th XII Legion was largely withdrawn from active operations. The reason for this sudden shift remains mostly speculative. One plausible and often touted theory is that the Warhounds were kept in reserve as a contingency force, a blunt instrument to be unleashed in the event of a catastrophic failure in the Emperor's campaigns. A darker hypothesis suggests that they were deliberately held in check, a weapon to be turned on potentially disloyal factions within the Emperor's own rank, should the need ever arise. Regardless of the truth, this enforced restraint only sharpened their hunger for war, as they continued to grow in numbers and ferocity, while training ceaselessly at the side of the Emperor. Despite their limited deployments during the early stages of the Unification Wars, the 12th Legion's relentlessness and savagery earned them the personal attention of the Emperor. Their ferocity in battle, combined with their dogged determination, inspired the Master of Mankind to bestow the title upon them of the War Hounds. It was a name that resonated deeply within the Legion's culture, as they adopted the image of red hounds as their insignia, a symbol of loyalty and their relentlessness. This period of relative inactivity marked the calm before the storm. Though their numbers were modest compared to some of their fellow legions, the Warhounds had cultivated a reputation of unending aggression, even amongst the Emperor's other creations. In the centuries to come, this small but formidable force would be transformed under his influence and that of their gene-sire Angron into the blood-soaked warriors of the World Eaters, a legion destined to carve their names into the stars, with infamy, steel, and slaughter being their calling card. Make war upon the Imperium of man. What is it you think the legions have been doing for the last 10,000 years? War does not end with a single victory or a single planet. It is an eternal creature that outlives men and their tiny triumphs. Excerpt from XII the Silence-bringer, warrior of the World Eaters. Amongst the 20 Space Marine legions crafted during the first founding, none instilled the same dread and primal fear upon their opponents as the World Eaters. While the Night Lords might have sown compliance through terror, the White Scars might have struck like a storm from nowhere, and the Space Wolf left a trail of ruin in their wake. But the deployment of the World Eaters to a campaign was a harbinger of absolute annihilation. Their methods were unyielding and horrifyingly personal. Unlike the devastation brought through virus bombs or orbital firestorms, the World Eaters painted their conquests in blood. One chain axe strike and one bolt round at a time. The Emperor of Mankind, seeking to reunify humanity under the banner of the Imperium following the horrors of the Age of Strife, envisioned an end to internecine wars that had fractured humanity's civilization. This grand ambition was known as the Great Crusade, as he sought to unite every lost world and colony of humanity, forging a galaxy-wide empire capable of withstanding the threats of chaos, alien species, and humanity's own self-destructive nature. To accomplish this, the Emperor crafted the Legions Astartes, with genetically enhanced superhuman warriors who would serve as the vanguard of his armies. These Space Marine legions embodied his vision, wielding unmatched martial prowess and an unshakable commitment to the imperial truth. While they were not merely soldiers, instead they would be the instruments of the Emperor's will. And so, from this ilk, the World Eaters would stand out significantly due to their tactics, their practices, and their ethos, much like the Revenant Legion would. Second-hand accounts show that much of their early history was lost, and that even some of their later history was fragmented at best. What fragments do remain show that the World Eaters never particularly looked for city-states to draw strength or resources from, further still separating them from their fellow legions. With that overview completed, now we will be going into further detail, in particular starting with the early years of the War Hounds, the Sarfrak Liberation, where the Legion's first recorded engagement would occur. The Liberation marked their debut on the battlefields of the Unification Wars, as they were deployed as the Emperor's spearhead, and they unleashed annihilation assaults with a ferocity that even stunned seasoned warriors and the Custodes. Their relatively small numbers were compensated by the sheer audacity and combat doctrine that prioritized overwhelming close quarters force and devastation. While the Liberation demonstrated the fledgling Legion's power, their role in the later stages of the Unification Wars was significantly more restrained. After these early victories, the Emperor would sparingly use them. Years later, during the pacification of Cephalic hives, during an unknown year in the 30th millennium, the Emperor would bestow upon them the title of War Hounds, due to the campaign being fought amidst sprawling micro-hive cities on Terra. These urban hellscapes were rife with entrenched gang warfare and narcotic-fueled insurrections, which presented the ideal theater for the Warhounds' aggressive tactics, showing that their movements throughout the micro-hives strongly resembled that of hunting hounds. Their tenacity and savagery systematically dismantled resistance within the Scythic hives, and it quickly led to Imperial compliance spreading throughout the area. Later, during the 30th millennium, the Warhounds would be called again during the Cerberus insurrection, where the Warhounds would earn their reputation once again, since the Cerberus insurrection was a brutal conflict that tested their mettle against some of the most formidable adversaries of the era. Cerberus was a sprawling asteroid prison colony that had erupted into a violent anarchy. The insurrections included Trar, which were a cadre of Thunder Warriors, the precursors to the Space Marines, genetically engineered super soldiers who were physically stronger than any astartes, and were some of the Emperor's earliest works, thought to be long extinct. The Terran 22nd Dracos Regiment of the Imperial Army initially attempted to quell the rebellion, but found themselves utterly overwhelmed and their equipment along with their weapons confiscated. The Emperor, unwilling to risk a prolonged period of chaos, dispatched the Warhounds with a simple, chilling mandate: reclaim Cerberus and make an example out of those who defied him. In a campaign that lasted a mere 5 solar hours, the 12th Legion achieved total dominance. When asked by the leader of the second wave of Imperial forces how many prisoners they had taken, Praetor Commander Caleb Hax tersely replied that no such orders had been given, so none would be taken. The aftermath revealed the full extent of the Warhounds' savagery. Reports from cleanup operations described the tunnels and choke points having been turned into blood-soaked charnel houses, and the remnants of the Thunder Warriors were found slain amidst piles of Astartes dead, as they had made their last stand. Insurgents were slaughtered in droves, and many cut down while firing in blind terrors. The second wave's task was now essentially grimly hunting the few survivors hiding in the asteroid's labyrinthian depths. Cerberus Primary was utterly and completely annihilated, and its rebellion snuffed out in both blood and fire. Later, in the mid-800s of the 30th millennium, the Nova Shendek campaign would occur. This marked one of the most dour campaigns in the Imperium's history, in particular that involving the Warhounds. The world of Nova Shendek was an alien hellscape inhabited by colossal intelligent Xenos creatures known simply as worms. These nightmarish beings were armed with bioelectrical filaments along with sharp metallic spines, which they embedded into their bodies in order to direct and discharge powerful energy surges. They were as intelligent as they were deadly, and the methods of their warfare reflected a savage nature. The filaments they used to slay Astartes and humans altogether were as thick as a man's body and longer than a human's height, as they rolled just below the surface of the planet, only to burst forth from the earth as earthworms would emerge from mud. The worms themselves were grotesque, their bodies twisted and massive, with 3 mouths lined with crystalline teeth. These mouths emitted a guttural sonic shriek, along with psychic whispers that reverberated through the mud and the marshlands of the world. During the early stages of the Great Crusade, the Warhounds would come upon the worms' territorial holdings, 3 star systems enslaved by these creatures, and methodically they would purge them. The Xenos were driven back into their homeworld of Nova Shendek, where the Imperium would face its most unprecedented discovery: humans. These humans were lost to the knowledge of mankind for millennia, and had been enslaved by the worms and hunted for food, along with being forced to crawl the surface of the world under the watchful eye of these abominable creatures. The Warhounds, joined by their Astartes allies, the Iron Warriors, and a sizable force of Imperial Army soldiers, were tasked with liberating these long-forgotten humans and freeing them from the oppressive yoke of their masters, all the while exterminating the worms that had enslaved them. The terrain itself proved nearly as deadly as the worms. The planet's surface was perpetually unstable, as lunar tides stirred vast oceans of mud, rendering the ground treacherous at all times. Imperial sentries were forced to use high-powered lasguns in order to detect the very movement of the worms beneath the mud. Explosives were seeded along newly constructed earthworks, detonating as they sank into the earthen trenches of the world. The Iron Warriors, then under the leadership of Perturabo, constructed vital titanic earthworks, trenches, and dikes in order to contain the shifting seas of mud. Imperial forces would then have to drain the marshlands, slowly regaining the land from the clutches of the worms. When the worms finally emerged in full force to drive back the Imperial invaders, they would be forced to encounter the wrath of some rather perturbed warhounds who had been made to wait for far too long. The battle that came was a horrendous affair, with a cost unacceptable to many Imperials. The warhounds succeeded in annihilating the worms, completely guaranteeing their extinction. The humans, once prey to these Xenos, were liberated and became fervent and ardent supporters of the Imperium, their loyalty cemented in this crucible of war. The next event of galactic importance is one whose date is actually known, a rarity in the campaigns of the early Warhounds. This would be the Xenocide of Osaran Pasbids, which occurred in the year 899 M30, when the Warhounds Legion, under the command of Praetor Erad Krug, found themselves embroiled in a deadly conflict at the outer reaches of the Great Crusade, near the Erudite Terminal. There, they were engaged in a brutal campaign against savage orc raiders of the Glortan Empire, a tribe of greenskins who had wandered out of the untracked abyss beyond the known galaxy. However, the Warhounds' battle against these raiders would soon be interrupted by an entirely unforeseen threat, the Ursaran Cybrids. The Cybrids were an ancient, terrifying Xeno species with the ability to manipulate space itself. These entities could teleport at will, warping reality and the fabric of existence in order to readily appear aboard Warhounds vessels. These powers were matched only by their savagery, and they brought a deadly new dimension into this ongoing conflict. Despite the overwhelming odds and being attacked on two sides by two distinctly powerful Xenos races, the Warhounds fought with their characteristic dogged tenacity. Their ships were decimated, and hundreds of orc vessels were destroyed in the savage exchanges. Yet the Cybrids' attacks were not enough to break the resolve or the fury of the Warhounds. Primarch Rabut Guilliman, upon hearing of this escalating threat, immediately dispatched reinforcements from the Ultramarines in order to aid the Warhounds. Two legions joined forces in order to hold the line against the Cybrids, with the Ultramarines' might bolstering the Warhounds' position. Together, the legions were able to mount a rather effective counteroffensive, systematically dismantling the Cybrids and their slave armies. As the Cybrids fell, their forces disintegrated, and the remaining orc raiders of the Glortan Empire were swiftly driven back outside of the known galaxy. Though the cost of this battle was rather steep, the Warhounds and the Ultramarines ultimately achieved victory. The bloody price had been high, but it was a price the Ultramarines were all too willing to pay, as it helped to avenge the grievous defeat that they had suffered nearly 6 decades earlier against the same Xenos Empire. Both the Nove Shendek campaign and the Xenocide of the Oresan Cybrids demonstrated the sheer brutality and the dogged determination of the Warhounds Legion. In the former, the Warhounds fought against overwhelming odds, not only to defeat the savage alien race, but to liberate and reunite a lost segment of humanity with its greater population. In the latter, they held the line against a mysterious and deadly Xenos threat, all the while dealing with the orcs, paying a bloody toll in order to ensure the survival of the Imperium. These campaigns were two of the many in the brutal history of the Warhounds, a history that would ultimately lead them down a dark and twisted path, culminating in their fall to the service of Khorne. Yet in these early days, the Legion's dedication to the Emperor and their unending pursuit of victory remained steadfast, and was seen as, while unpleasant, largely honorable, in particular their indomitable human spirit. After seeing the outcomes of many of these battles, the 12th Legion's role as the Emperor's enforcers of terror became solidified. Their methods were brutal as they were effective. From the battlefields of Southfrick to the dark tunnels of Cerberus, the Warhounds carved a bloody path that in essence led many forces to surrender at the mere mention of the 12th Legion. Their ferocity born on Terra would one day be augmented by that of the Nucerian gladiators. During this period of general readiness and lower deployment rates, the Legion remained in constant training and expanded its ranks. Whenever they were unleashed, it was a terrifying force of savagery. Every deployment was a symphony of destruction, as the astartes tore through their enemies' ranks with no regard for risk or casualty. To them, it was a crucible of bloodshed that the Emperor himself had deemed them worthy of. As the Great Crusade continued to go on, the warhounds became the Emperor's most reliable instruments of conquest. By circa 830, with the discovery of the first Primarchs, the XII Legion was temporarily divided into independent subcommands in order to better support the growing war effort and the legions who had found their Primarchs. These large forces, numbering in approximately 8,000 astartes, became known as the 13th Expeditionary Fleet, or the Bloody 13th, as they were tasked with the fiercest battles. The Bloody 13th would often fight alongside the Space Wolves, the Iron Warriors, and the Dark Angels in some of the Crusade's most grueling campaigns, and they became known as the Legion to Call when strategic stalemates demanded decisive action. Their assaults were rather fierce by comparison to the other legions' rather orderly forms of combat, shattering enemy lines with furious strikes. Victory, however, often came at a high cost to the Warhounds, which ironically allowed the three aforementioned legions to abstain from greater losses. However, to them, every battle was a victorious slaughter or a mutual annihilation, and they were happy with that role. In either case, the enemy would be left utterly broken and incapable of resistance. Despite their effectiveness, the Warhounds were far from universally admired. Their allies often regarded them with no small amount of caution, finding their unpredictability and violent temperament to be as dangerous to them as it was to their foes. Whispers would circulate that the Warhounds had executed Imperial Army auxiliary regiments they deemed as failures, and their harsh internal discipline was both a necessity and a reflection of their ferocious nature, which led to no small amount of derision from the other legions, in particular those who had already found their Primarchs. Bloodshed amongst the Warhounds themselves was not uncommon, as officers had to enforce a strict code in order to maintain order, but even this could not fully contain the tempestuous instincts of the Legion, as it became clear to all those who observed the 12th that the Warhounds were a double-edged sword, one that could cut the Imperium's enemies with unparalleled efficiency, but might one day turn its edge inwards. Storn made builders, Magnus thinkers, Guilliman raised bureaucrats, while Lorgar made priests, and the Khan vagrants. Of all of the legions, we are the only ones who are exactly what the Emperor wanted. All that the legions of Astartes were ever meant to be, conquerors. We aren't meant for the world that is coming, a new world that will rise from the ashes. We are only meant to burn this one down. Excerpt from Ibram Greer, Legion Master of the Warhounds. These words attributed to the Legion Master encapsulate the Warhounds' philosophy. They saw themselves as the purest expression of the Emperor's vision, designed for conquest, not for the peace that would follow. It was a belief that defined the Legion's actions and hinted at the darkness that would one day engulf them. As the Great Crusade progressed, the 12th Legion found themselves increasingly assigned to campaigns where annihilation was needed instead of liberation. The Imperial War Council, aware of the Legion's propensity for violence, came to regard the Warhounds as the ideal tool for such undertakings. Their unrestrained aggression and willingness to embrace destruction set upon them set them apart from the other legions tasked with more measured objectives. The Warhounds were once again unified under the banner of the Bloody 13th in order to be joined by a disparate collection of Imperial forces with similarly grim reputations. These included units deemed unsuitable for delicate operations requiring minimal collateral damage or precision strikes. Instead, the Warhounds and their allies were assigned to missions where total devastation was the goal. Prior to being reunited with their Primarch, the Legion had chosen Bodit as their mustering ground, where they, along with their allies, would essentially train, stage combat, and recruit from. This was an unforgiving volcanic world they had previously conquered, and the planet's harsh environment mirrored the ferocity of its occupants. Alongside the Warhounds, a particular series of forces decided to use the same world as a mustering ground and a base of operations. This would include feral world headhunters, brutal warriors drawn from savage planets who were recruited into the Imperial Army and were known for their ruthless and underhanded methods, which were often seen unbefitting of the Imperial Army, so they were segregated. Abhumans were also part of the group allowed to muster on Budget, who found a kinship with the Warhounds. Abhumans are genetic deviants tolerated by the Imperium for their strength and resilience, who added a savage edge to the forces gathered for the Great Crusade, but who were ultimately seen as less than, or only tolerable until the end of the Crusade. The Legio Audax, a Titan Legion who had been shrouded in suspicion following the infamous Lorraine Alpha massacres, their machines being seen as symbols of devastation rather than the god engines of the Mechanicum. All these groups, along with the Numian gun clans, who were nomadic techno-barbarians that had fiercely resisted imperial compliance for years before their reluctant induction into the Imperium, prior to being picked up by the Warhounds and seamlessly allowed to continue their practices as long as it aided the war effort. This grim alliance became synonymous with the destruction of any civilization they were set about, as they were wielded by the Imperium against their enemies when total eradication was deemed as the only viable solution.